From a compact, oddly modern-looking submachine gun handed to paratroopers dropping into chaos, to the single most recognizable silhouette of Nazi Germany's war machine, one weapon became inseparable from the darkest chapter of the 20th century: the gun in the hands of every movie villain storming a French village. The weapon soldiers reached for in the tightest, ugliest close-quarters fighting of World War II, and a design so ahead of its time that elements of it are still copied in firearms built today. This is the story of the MP40, and why a submachine gun built for speed and close combat became one of the most feared and recognizable weapons in history. By the mid-1930s, the German military was rebuilding itself from scratch, and rebuilding it with a very specific lesson learned from the trenches of the First World War. Trench warfare had shown that in tight spaces, dugouts, trench lines, urban streets, a soldier with a rifle was often too slow. Bolt-action rifles were accurate at range, but reloading between shots left a soldier exposed in the exact moments close combat was most brutal and most decided by who could put more rounds downrange first. Germany had experimented with this problem before. The MP-18, developed near the end of World War I, had been one of the earliest true submachine guns ever fielded, proof the concept worked. But by the 1930s, German military planners wanted something built specifically around a new kind of warfare they were actively preparing for. Fast, mobile, mechanized. Blitzkrieg doctrine depended on small units moving quickly and independently, and those units needed a weapon that could put out serious close-range firepower without the weight and bulk of a full rifle. The man most responsible for solving that problem was Heinrich Vollmer, a German engineer working through the 1930s on a series of increasingly refined submachine gun designs. His earlier work, the MP36, fed directly into an intermediate design called the MP38, and it's the MP38 that really set the template. Simplify everything, strip away anything decorative or unnecessary. Build a weapon that could be manufactured fast and cheap, without sacrificing reliability in the field. Then came the outbreak of war, and with it, an even more urgent demand. More guns, faster, from factories that didn't have unlimited time or unlimited skilled labor. That pressure produced the MP40, formally adopted in 1940. And it's here that the design actually became historically significant, not just as a weapon, but as a piece of engineering philosophy. Earlier submachine guns, including Germany's own MP38, still relied heavily on machined metal parts, precision cut, time-consuming, expensive to produce at the volume a world war demanded. The MP40 threw that approach out almost entirely. Vollmer's design leaned hard into stamped sheet metal construction. Instead of machining a solid block of steel down into a receiver, factories could press sheet metal into shape using stamping dies, a process that was faster, cheaper, and critically, could be done by less skilled labor working in dispersed factories across the country. This wasn't a small tweak. It was a fundamental rethink of how a firearm could be manufactured at wartime scale, and it directly influenced small arms manufacturing philosophy for decades afterward. Look at almost any modern submachine gun or stamped receiver rifle today, and you're looking at a design lineage that traces back through this thinking. The MP40 also introduced a folding stock, unusual for the era, which made it dramatically more compact for the exact soldiers who needed compactness most. Paratroopers jumping out of aircraft, tank crews who needed a personal weapon that didn't take up half the vehicle, and vehicle drivers who needed something they could actually maneuver in a cramped cabin. It fired the 9x19mm Parabellum round from a 32-round magazine, a pistol-caliber round, not as powerful as a rifle cartridge, but devastating at the close ranges the weapon was actually designed for, and controllable enough that troops with limited training could still put rounds on target quickly. There's a persistent myth worth clearing up here. For decades, this weapon has often been informally called the Schmeisser by soldiers and by pop culture alike, after German small arms designer Hugo Schmeisser. But Schmeisser had essentially nothing to do with the MP40's design. He'd developed the earlier MP18 and held a patent used on the MP40's magazine, which is likely where the confusion originated. But the rifle Allied soldiers nicknamed after him was actually Heinrich Vollmer's work almost entirely. It's one of the most persistent cases of mistaken credit in firearms history. Every feared weapon eventually gets compared to its rival, and for the MP40, that rival was American, the Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun. Already a cultural icon in the US, thanks to Prohibition-era gangster mythology years before the war even began. The comparison is almost a study in opposite philosophies. The Thompson was machined from solid steel, beautifully overbuilt, heavy, and expensive. Some estimates put its production cost at several times that of an MP40. It fired a heavier .45 ACP round with genuine stopping power, and it had a reputation for rugged reliability that soldiers trusted completely. But all that machined steel came at a cost beyond money. The Thompson was heavy, awkward to produce quickly, and manufacturing simply couldn't scale at the pace a world war demanded. The MP40 represented almost the exact opposite bet. Lighter, faster to produce, built from stamped sheet metal that traded some of that overbuilt ruggedness for sheer manufacturing speed. It was, in almost every sense, a more modern approach to the same problem, and it's worth noting that American small arms manufacturing eventually moved in the same direction. The Thompson was gradually supplemented and then replaced in American service by the M3 grease gun, a cheap stamped metal design that borrowed the exact manufacturing philosophy Germany had already proven out with the MP40. In a strange way, even the side that despised everything the MP40 represented ended up admitting, through their own wartime engineering decisions, that Vollmer's approach to the problem had been the right one. Here's where the MP40's story takes an odd turn. Not a manufacturing scandal like some weapons in this kind of story, but a reputation built almost entirely on wartime misinformation. Allied propaganda and soldier folklore during the war dramatically overstated how many German troops actually carried the MP40. Popular memory, reinforced later by films and photographs, created the impression that entire German squads were armed wall-to-wall with submachine guns, an unstoppable wave of automatic fire. The reality was very different. The MP40 was never issued as a universal infantry weapon. German squad doctrine through most of the war was actually built around the rifle and machine gun combination, typically just 1 or 2 MP40s per squad, usually carried by squad leaders and specialized troops, like paratroopers and armored vehicle crews, not the entire unit. The MP40's actual battlefield role was closer to specialized close-quarters tool than standard-issue rifle replacement. But the myth mattered more than the reality when it came to reputation. Allied soldiers facing MP40 fire in close combat, house-to-house fighting, trench clearing, ambush situations, remembered the terrifying sound and speed of automatic fire far more vividly than the actual proportion of enemy troops carrying it. That psychological impact outlasted the accurate battlefield statistics by decades, and it's a huge part of why the weapon became so disproportionately feared and disproportionately remembered compared to its actual numbers in the field. Manufacturing scaled dramatically as the war ground on. Estimates suggest well over 1 million MP40s were produced by war's end, manufactured by multiple companies working from the same stamped metal approach that had made mass production possible in the first place. Variants followed, some produced with slightly different furniture, some with modifications intended to reduce production time even further as the war situation deteriorated, and Germany's manufacturing base came under increasing strain from Allied bombing and resource shortages. Captured MP40s were also widely used by Allied and resistance forces throughout the war, an ironic footnote given how central it became to the German war image. Resistance fighters across occupied Europe frequently equipping themselves with whatever German weapons they managed to capture or scavenge from battlefields. After the war, the design's influence didn't disappear with Germany's defeat. Several post-war submachine gun designs across multiple countries borrowed directly from the MP40's stamped construction philosophy, refining and simplifying it even further. It became, in a strange way, a foundational text for an entire generation of submachine gun engineering that followed it, admired by weapons designers on the very sides that had fought against it. There's no single battlefield feat that defines the MP40 the way a record-setting shot defines a sniper rifle. Its legend was built differently, through sheer repeated presence at the center of the war's most brutal close-quarters fighting. Picture the close urban combat of the Eastern Front, Stalingrad in particular, where fighting collapsed down to individual rooms, stairwells, and rubble-strewn streets, and rifles built for open-field ranges became almost useless. In that kind of fighting, a compact automatic weapon that could clear a doorway or a stairwell in seconds became disproportionately valuable and disproportionately terrifying to whoever was on the receiving end of it. Soldiers on both sides who survived urban combat in that war often described the sound of automatic fire echoing through a collapsed building as one of the most psychologically brutal parts of the entire experience. Not because of raw numbers, but because in a space that small, automatic fire meant there was often nowhere left to go. That's really the MP40's legend. Not one dramatic shot. A pattern, repeated across hundreds of collapsed buildings and trench lines across an entire continent at war, until the weapon itself became inseparable from the memory of the fighting. Few weapons from any war have become as visually iconic as the MP40. Its distinctive silhouette, the angular receiver, the vertical magazine, the folding stock, became visual shorthand almost immediately after the war, and has stayed that way for 80 years. It became the default weapon handed to German soldier characters in film after film, Saving Private Ryan among the most famous modern examples. Its sound design alone instantly recognizable to audiences who've never fired a real gun in their lives. Video games leaned into it even harder. The Wolfenstein series built an entire aesthetic around it. Call of Duty's World War II titles feature it prominently across multiple games. Battlefield's historical entries treat it as a signature weapon of the era. For an entire generation of gamers, the MP40 became their first mental image of a World War II German soldier, often before they'd seen a single documentary or photograph from the actual war. That level of cultural saturation is unusual even among famous historical firearms. And it comes with a complicated weight the AR-15 or a modern sniper rifle simply doesn't carry. The MP40 isn't just associated with combat in the abstract. It's permanently and specifically associated with Nazi Germany, with a regime responsible for some of the worst atrocities in human history. Its silhouette doesn't just mean World War II-era weapon, the way an M1 Garand might. In film and games, it functions almost as visual shorthand for the regime itself, which is a genuinely different, heavier kind of infamy than most weapons in history ever carry, and worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over for the sake of a clean story. So why is the MP40 remembered with this much weight, more than 80 years after the war that produced it ended? Not because of raw numbers, and it was never the wall-to-wall standard-issue weapon popular memory imagines it to have been. Not because of any single battlefield feat either. There's no equivalent to a record-setting shot in this story. It's feared and remembered because of the same kind of intersection that defines the most infamous weapons in history. Genuinely significant engineering, a manufacturing philosophy that reshaped how firearms would be built for decades afterward. Repeated visceral presence in the most brutal, closest-range fighting of the deadliest conflict in human history. And an inseparable, permanent association with the single most notorious regime of the modern era, one that no amount of engineering admiration can or should separate from the weapon's legacy. Take away any one of those three factors, and this becomes a very different, much smaller story. A significant engineering achievement that never saw close combat becomes a footnote in manufacturing history. A weapon used constantly in brutal fighting but disconnected from any singular regime becomes just another World War II firearm among dozens. And a weapon associated with a notorious regime but with unremarkable engineering never becomes the design template that influenced everything that followed it. Heinrich Vollmer set out to solve a manufacturing problem. How do you arm an entire mechanized war machine quickly enough using sheet metal and less skilled labor instead of scarce machinists and expensive tooling? He almost certainly wasn't thinking about how that weapon's silhouette would still be instantly recognizable to teenagers playing video games 80 years later, or how permanently it would become tied to the regime that carried it. That's the strange, uncomfortable afterlife of a truly influential wartime design. It outlives the war. It outlives the regime that carried it. It outlives everyone who ever fired it in anger or had it fired at them. And it ends up belonging entirely to memory, to film reels and game engines and history documentaries, still doing the work of representing something far larger and far darker than the object itself ever was. The MP40 isn't feared because it was the deadliest weapon of its war. Plenty of weapons from that conflict killed far more people. It's feared because of what it came to represent every single time its silhouette appeared. In a stairwell in Stalingrad, in a French village during the occupation, or on a screen 80 years later. And on that, there's very little disagreement at all.